Okay. All right. So if you have any questions as I start rolling, please just jump in. And everybody can see the share screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this will be the second to the last presentation of this series, basically. This is the Neanderthals reconsidered, and we will start with healthcare among the Neanderthals. I like this little cartoon, but there was a theory that Neanderthal damage of 500 fossil skeletons, all of the adult fossils had broken, mended bones in the upper torso, just like American rodeo rider injuries. And interestingly, there was no gender difference, which implied that female Neanderthals were in on the hunts as well, potentially. And it was Lee Berger, actually, of Naledi fame, and Eric Trinkhaus, who came up with this idea that Neanderthal injuries had identical injury profiles with American rodeo riders, that they were getting too close to large animals, basically, and occasionally getting injured. This spread basically compares Neanderthals with injuries in London, New York, and New Mexico. And basically, it's head, arm, trunk injuries that tend to show up the most in all of these groups. These signs of injury were found in almost every well-preserved adult skeleton, basically, concentrated in the head and neck. So their hunting strategies often require proximity to large animals, and that's what happened. So that was the theory in 1995. And the majority of injuries are healed or partially healed, indicating that Neanderthals were getting treated for their injuries, and that other Neanderthals were showing some level of compassion, and that some of the injured would not have survived without the care of other Neanderthals. Interestingly, most recent comparisons to modern humans show that contemporary, at the time, sapiens had very similar injuries. And ultimately, Trinkhaus rejected the rodeo hypothesis, thinking that there was no difference during that period of modern humans and Neanderthals, as well as current-day hunter-gatherers who engaged with large animals had the similar kinds of injuries. Okay, so life was tough if you were trying to tackle large kinds of creatures. So ultimately, by 2009, no evidence for the idea that Neanderthals are more frequently traumatized than modern populations. And again, some of these were female, indicating that maybe there was a little division of labor reflected in the trauma pattern. A 2011 study showed similar injury profiles in the skeletal remains of a variety of groups, basically. Let's see, forward, backwards. Interestingly, looking at early Homo sapiens sites of this period, nearly all had poor health indicators, severe growth interruptions, lines on the teeth, hearing impairments, infections, tumors, bone degeneration, gum disease, scurvy, those kinds of things. One modern human in Czechoslovakia, in addition to a broken arm, had 3 other injuries, very likely from an assault. And a famous burial at Sungur, Russia, probably was a murder case since he had his throat cut. Similar, basically, traumatic injuries in both groups. I'm pitching, based on some research, that Neanderthals practiced Medicare for all. That Neanderthals had a very tough life. Their hunting tactics created the possibility of more injury. And again, no adult Neanderthal skeleton doesn't show at least one fracture. And it's common to see multiple healed fractures. We know from the data that Neanderthals, few of them lived to the ripe old age of 45. Let's see, got to check my battery. Okay. But beware of preservation bias, because older bones tend to not survive as well. So there may have been 60-year-old Neanderthals, but we don't have much data for it. But basically, the proposition here is that they practice Medicare for all. Neanderthals cared for their own sick and injured, and likely, like almost all other hunter-gatherer groups, used plant-based medications that they discovered. One of the classic injury profiles is from Shenandar one in Iraq, the cave that housed a whole bunch of Neanderthals, and one of them, labeled number 1, is an adult male, 40 to 45 years old, had a trauma to the left side of his head that basically broke his eye socket, probably blinded him as a consequence. He also had a left arm amputated above the elbow. There's a similar thing at Krapina in Croatia. And Shandar 1 has been described as a one-armed, partially blind, possibly deaf, crippled man, could have made no pretense of hunting or gathering his own food. That he survived for years after his trauma was a testament to Neanderthal compassion and humanity. That's Trinkhaus in 93. So he's probably the most famous individual benefiting from Neanderthal compassion and care. And he had an astonishing number of physical difficulties. Right arm suffered a terrible multiple fracture, shriveled after healing badly. It was most likely amputated. There's another amputation at Krapina, as I said. His shoulder blade was malformed, may have led to collarbone being unusually small and developing a serious bacterial infection. This guy, by the way, was immortalized in the Jean All's Clan of the Cave Bear. He was the shaman Kreb, which led to a lot of young people becoming paleontologists. Okay, so he's famous in anthropological history. This is his skeleton. So left facial trauma, deaf in one ear with bony growths, right humerus is broken in 2 places, lost his right arm, fracture and osteoarthritis of the right foot, severe degenerative disease, and all his traumas had healed before his death. So clearly required some caregiving.
Yeah.
And yes?
Yeah, Charlie, would gangrene have been a problem, do you think?
Possibly, although I don't know that I've seen evidence of it being discussed in any of the research I've seen. So we don't have really, as I'll review the evidence we do have, but the likelihood is that almost all historical hunter-gatherer groups have used natural plant medications that they discovered, and I'll review it in a little bit. He had what's known as surfer's ear. I have a picture coming up, and that is called surfer's ear because it often shows up in surfers who do a lot of cold water swimming, but it can be caused by other things like infection or injury, etc. But he lived to a ripe old age for a Neanderthal. And after coming through all of this, however, the original data sort of hinted that slower reactions may have been his ultimate downfall, because there's evidence that he may have been caught in a rock fall that ultimately killed him. So a social perspective on Neanderthals would indicate that they basically took care of each other. They lived in groups with probably deep investments in each other's well-being, because that was required for the survival of the group. If you didn't take care of your hunters, you were in deep trouble. And there was a competence to apply knowledgeable approaches to preserve health. 300,000 years of survival leads to knowing how to care for each other, basically. And care for illness and injury and support for impairments was probably widespread and motivated by similar close social bonds that we have, basically. They were taking care of their ill and injured, and they probably almost certainly shared common human emotional and practical response to vulnerability and suffering. This was probably reflected in the care of their kids, attitudes toward the body at death through burial practice, etc. If you think that we historically developed sociality, I believe, has been fundamental to survival of all hominins in anthropological history. And I think that is also evident in what we know of the Neanderthals. The person that has done the most research on this is Penny Spickens, who did a fabulous paper, long paper on basically, I think she entitled it "Living to Fight Another Day," the significance of Neanderthal healthcare. And she thinks that Neanderthal medical skills were remarkably similar to our own ancestors' methods, and included wound dressing, fever management, midwifery, and a budding pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies, basically. A few really beat up Neanderthals are hard to explain without something like this kind of knowledge. A woman, Neanderthal woman at Saint Cesar, had a dreadful head injury. Shandar III had probably a collapsed lung due to a chest stabbing. And they hung around for weeks before they both died, but clearly somebody was taking care of them. At Krapina, Croatia, 11 individuals exhibited signs of injuries that healed during their lifetimes. Another group of Krapina had blunt trauma injuries. Another Krapina had a depressed parietal skull fracture. Another set showed degeneration of cervical spine nerves. Another had fragmented rib with a neoplasm attached. There's another who had a fractured, well-healed right clavicle, ulnar with possible amputation. So lots of examples in the skeletal history. And there's growing evidence that Neanderthals were using medicinal plants. At least it can be highly speculated that that's what they were being used for. At Shenandoah, there was the famous Shenandoah 4 burial that was originally described as a flower burial, okay, where they found flower pollen from a variety of plants. All plants, interestingly, that had potential medicinal uses. But as you never know, the last study that popped up in my computer today basically reinterprets the original flower burial theory that in fact they think it was burrowing bees that pulled in all the pollen that was found in Shenandoah 4's burial site. So continued data gives reinterpretation basically. But other kinds of evidence also comes into play. So dental plaque has been used to identify what Neanderthals and other species were eating. You can tell from what's left in the plaque. At El Cedron, a group of a dozen, probably a family of Neanderthals, they found evidence for yarrow and chamomile in their teeth. Now, both of those can be used either medicinally or for food flavoring, so it's not totally clear. There's no absolute clear-cut evidence of herbalism in Neanderthals, but their deep knowledge of plants almost certainly implies that they were using some for medicinal purposes. The group El Cedron is a very interesting place because not only do we have 12 Neanderthals, they were a family of adults, children, teenagers. They were also cannibalized. So a really interesting cave of Neanderthals, basically. Both yarrow and chamomile can be used as flavorings. And so the proof of self-medication is indirect from healing and lack of infection of some horrific wounds like those at Shenandoah 1 and St. Cezanne and Krupina. So that it's inferential. The interesting one at El Cedron is a teenager who almost certainly died of a dental abscess. And this was at 50K. They showed evidence in him that he had an oral bacteria that is likely the proof of his abscess. But there's also evidence that he was eating poplar tree ingredients, which contain salicylic acid, which is the main ingredient in aspirin, a natural painkiller. There's also evidence that he probably had an intestinal parasite that was producing diarrhea, but also that he was eating food fungus that contained penicillin. Okay, so we've got one kid who basically shows evidence of two plant usages that were clearly potentially medicinal for a specific set of diseases that he actually had. So part of the question about aging in Neanderthals is the whole idea of preservation of bones and older guys, older skeletons, not preserving as well as younger, tougher bones. So we have relatively few old age Neanderthals, basically. That's the quick gist on healthcare. Then Shea Neanderthal, okay, Neanderthal food choices. This comes out of Rebecca Ragg Sykes' book on kindred. And this is a picture that she had painted that includes all of the known species that Neanderthals ate. Okay, so birds, bears, rhinos, goats, elephants, marine animals, etc. will reveal. Okay, so enormous range of plant and animal usage basically were on the Neanderthals plate. This is a deli in England named after our guys here. Okay, so clearly not just scavengers, they were formidable hunters. Their diet was heavily based on large terrestrial herbivores, such as reindeer, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses. We've reviewed the hunting strategies that were really interesting historically. And they clearly picked prey from throughout the herds that they were hunting, not just the old and the weak and the young, but the entire gamut of animals that they hunted. Teeth plaque revealed that in general, Neanderthals ate about 80% of their meal was meat and 20+% was plant. Now, the latter data is growing, indicating that it may have been well more than 20%, but those are harder to find. And again, perseveration is an issue in all of these analyses. If you do carbon and nitrogen stable isotope analysis, it will often reflect protein, not carbs that you're eating. Meat effectively swamps any plant protein in this methodology, meaning that even if half of the protein was vegetable in origin, isotopically, they still look more like meat-eating hyenas than grass-eating horses. Okay, so that's a methodological issue. But they were clearly herbaceous connoisseurs, eating roots and shoots as well as meat. The existence of digging sticks is strong support for their use of vegetation, basically. Today, Europe has about 1,000 edible plant species, though many of them are no longer used. And indigenous tundra living societies have long known at least 20 to 40 species that are good to eat, many of which would have grown farther south during cold periods. They include firewood, berries, fungi, roots, tubers, seaweed, lichen are all potentially edible meals. And the Krapina Neanderthals were eating significant amounts of unprocessed grasses, tubers, and other plants. The Neanderthals lived in mixed wooded habitats where ate probably more plants than those dwelling in open, more northern countries. But in general, the evidence suggests Neanderthals obtained most of their protein from meat, given their caloric requirements, which was high. And some of the data we're now getting from crap and poop, otherwise known as coprolites. There is lots of plant matter, probably roots and tubers that is found in Neanderthal poop. And we're probably only seeing a fraction of the plants that were actually eaten, especially true for cooked foods, which are broken down more quickly. The Belgian spy region Neanderthals, up to 1/5 of their protein was coming from non-animal sources. Aside in Germany, evidence of elephant carcasses associated with a wooden spear in their rib, but widespread evidence that they were also eating smaller prey, including evidence in Italy that they were eating fish and shellfish. Portugal, France, and Spain and Gibraltar all have big time evidence of marine life eating by Neanderthals, as well as birds, okay, as we'll see. They were using toothpicks routinely, and so has pretty much every Homo hominin type, going back to Homo habilis, where we have evidence in almost every hominin species that toothpick use was routine. lots of damage sometimes from them. We have it in Neanderthals from Siemens de los Huesos, from Propina, El Cedrón, and in Spain as well. The calculation for Neanderthal caloric requirements is that they needed 3,500 to 5,000 calories per day. That's twice what we tend to eat. And that's about 6.5 pounds of game, basically. So that's a lot of animals. To feed a group of 10, you're looking at 300,000 calories. You would need 3 reindeer every 7 days would hit that mark. Probably 50% more than wolf packs were doing. So lots of meat gathering and eating.
Was it a metabolic issue?
Yes, that given their body shape and size and construction, they had high caloric requirements, basically, has been the consistent theorizing about Neanderthals. The main food supply were clearly ungulates, deer, horse, goat, aurochs, the ancient cow, basically, bull, and clearly the most common food in the Neanderthal diet. But they also hunted larger animals like rhinos, and we know from Newmark Nord, where they discovered those 70 elephants, the humongous largest mammal creature that ever lived, the Antiquus elephant that was 12 feet high and 28,000 pounds. They found 70 of them in this German site, basically. So they did hunt larger animals at times. What strategy they used is not perfectly known, whether it was pits or group hunting, etc. But they found other elephants in Spain and other places as well. Interestingly, at Spy in Belgium, it was woolly rhinos and goats, but also lots of fungi and plants as well. Interesting, there's very little evidence for the consumption of small carnivores. Okay, so like wild cats, etc. There's very little data that Neanderthals hunted them, although they pretty much hunted everything else. But in one spot in Spain, high consumption of meat and marrow. Neanderthals could be considered extreme carnivores. They were consuming, one of you birders out there, tell me the pronunciation. Cause? Birds, what?
They're called chuffs.
Chuffs.
Yes.
Chuffs, I always get it wrong. Chuffs. Birds with black plumage, as you'll see important later on. They can be captured at night in caves, and they've shown experimentally that this could actually be fairly easy to do if you knew about their habits at nighttime. The mammals they caught varied by region, basically. Wherever they were living, they picked off whatever animal was in this. So everything from cave bears to woolly mammoths to reindeer, wild ass, bison, hippos, deer, ibex, rabbits, marmots, beavers, porcupines are all on the list for what they caught. And they were also catching what historically they were denied, which was that they could figure out how to hunt fast prey like small animals like rabbits and birds. But there's plenty of sites where Neanderthals clearly were exploiting small game. So they could hunt anything that was out there, basically. These guys were terrific hunter-gatherers, basically. And one lesson, though, about hunting historically is that you had to be careful about how much lean meat you ate, because this could quickly lead to starvation if you didn't know better. To get enough vital micronutrients like fats and vitamins and minerals, you need to eat fat, brain, tongue, eyes, and marrow, implying the need for double the number of animals that you need to be hunting in order to get these vital ingredients. So protein poisoning is where you get too much protein from excessive lean meat with not enough fat and carbohydrates for a long period. It's called rabbit starvation, mal de caribou, and it produces malnutrition. It produces too much ammonia and urea and amino acids in the blood, liver, and kidney effects. It's relatively rare, but it can be fatal, basically. So Neanderthals were hunting prime herd animals, but interestingly, from what they left at kill sites, etc., they were often taking the fat and the fatter meat, but not the lean meat. They would leave that at the kill site and bring only the other stuff, brain, offal, marrow, back to their home sites, basically. And the unknown area is how much Neanderthals were eating insects. Okay, so in Africa, there was a lot of that, but yeah, probably like in most other areas, they also knew about bees and honey. Even chimpanzees do. So probably Neanderthals were also putting honey on their food tray as well. There's evidence that they were using fire, many hearths. They were using boiling in bark, skulls, animal stomachs, stone bowls. Those are all speculation, but there's evidence that they were eating boiled foods from the leftovers in their plaque. And gnawing and the bite marks from hyena teeth are always underneath the cut marks from the Neanderthal stone tools. So Neanderthals got there first, hyenas got there second, okay? Although teeth evidence indicates that there were clear periods of starvation that produced these lines in the enamel in teeth as they were developing. And so teeth plaque has been important in terms of identifying what the cuisine of Neanderthals were. At Spy, there was heavy metal meat usage, but also mushrooms, roots, and tubers were found. At El Cedron, on the other hand, there's no evidence of meat, but lots of evidence of mushrooms, pine nuts, and moss being gathered there. So different regional cuisines depending on what was available. And as we'll see, some cannibalism going on. It's clear that Neanderthals could swim because they were diving for some kinds of clams. And 24% of the specimens at one point were gathered directly from the seafloor as living animals at 2 to 4 meters underwater. Okay, so good evidence that they had to dive to a certain depth in order to get these particular clams that they appeared to like. And they were also getting seashells that they were reusing as tools, basically. And it turns out that the shiny quality of these clams proves that they were gathered underwater, not at the seashore. So the opaque ones were washed up on the beach, whereas these guys, you had to go diving in order to get them, and that's what they found for Neanderthals at these sites. There's again evidence for surfer's ear in at least a couple of dozen Neanderthals. And this phenomenon was actually noted in the very first Marcelin Boule, the French paleontologist who did the first monogram in 1911 on the Neanderthal skeleton from France. And this is surfer's ear, where you get this bony development that can make you deaf, basically, found in a number not only here in France, but also in Shenandoah in Iraq as well. This is Gibraltar today, and these are Gorman's and Vanguard Cave, where they found the Neanderthal hash mark. And Finlayson has been doing research for the last 30 years here. But 100K ago, this is what it looked like, basically. There was no sea within a mile or two of the cave sites, basically, where Neanderthals were hanging out. There were also the animals up here were being hunted, as well as the sea lion, marine animals that they were eating as well. There's evidence for marine diet in Neanderthals using coastal resources going back 150K. At Gibraltar, monk seals, dolphins, shark, clams, shellfish, tortoises, turtles were all being munched on. Some evidence for freshwater fish. How they were captured is unknown, but there's more data showing up recently about Neanderthals and fishing. In Portugal, they were dining on mollusks, everything from limpets to mussels and clams, crustaceans, brown crabs, fish like shark and mullet, birds like geese, cormorants, puffin, egrets, etc., and dolphins and seals as well. Whether most likely these were washed up on shore, but they could have been hunting seals if they were close enough. Lots of evidence in Portugal for roasting brown crab. And so seafood consumption has been documented in at least 24 different Neanderthal sites. At Gruta da Figueroa in Portugal, lots of crabs, limpets, which we would hunt in my youth, as an example. Crustaceans, sea urchins were all part of the pattern. In one site, they found 500 to 600 fish bones, as well as seals and dolphins. So they were actively eating shellfish, basically. But both surf and turf, okay, at some of the same sites there were evidence for eating red deer, rabbits, ibex, horses, etc. So anything that was available, including pine nuts for additional flavoring. Okay, crabs, marine. At Gibraltar, pretty much they had the ingredients for a paella, except for the rice, basically. Again, at Gibraltar, there's evidence for 161 different species of birds that have been uncovered in Gorham's Cave, many with tooth and cut marks, suggesting that it was the Neanderthals who ate them. And lots of growing evidence of exploitation of rabbits and hares being hunted and eaten. And part of the problem historically was, again, preservation bias, because small bone creatures don't last as well in the fossil record. We've mentioned the 70 butchered elephants in Neumarkt in Germany. At Schöningen, the lakeside, 50 massive horses that left fossils for. One of the questions there, interestingly enough, because they were all found in more water than you would expect, that were they actually leaving them there to ferment, okay, and then coming back later to chew them up, basically. Lots of starch, as you'll see. And it's sort of been plants that underlie the dramatic U-turn in our understanding of their diet, basically. whether they're being used for eating vegetables or medicinal uses. We know pine nuts, moss, mushrooms being eaten in a variety of places, lots of starchy plants, date palms, legumes, grass seeds at a variety of places. Shenandoah has a whole group of plants that have been discovered and that they were potentially mixing materials, including nuts and shells to spice up the cooking, basically, using nuts and wild herbs combined with legumes, because legumes like beans and lentils and peas have a kind of bitter taste due to the tannins, and you had to soak and leach them in order to get the bitter taste. But apparently some was left in for the bitter taste to make it a little more interesting to eat. So fecal biomarkers have shown evidence for both carnivore and herbivore diets in this group. One big study found that they were using at least 61 different taxa of plants from 26 different plant families found at 17 different archaeological sites. So lots of different plants, basically, lots of starch, lots of seeds, lots coming from data from teeth plaque, coprolites, genetics. And they were clearly eating foods that had limited seasonal time frames, like berries and greens and roots that only showed up at certain times, and Neanderthals knew what times to basically dig them up. They were eating date palms, vetch, water lily roots, so they were walking into water in order to get these foods, parsnip, mushrooms, tubers. And there's clear evidence that Neanderthals were using grindstones and pestles to grind versions of modern wheat and barley. So they were producing flour, basically, to cook. Cooking implies containers, so Neanderthals had to have some way to contain this stuff. There's evidence of they're using figs and olives and pistachios in the Mediterranean and West Asia, lots of different seeds. So lots of food, lots of variety, basically. In Jordan, spicing up foods. They have found carbonized crumbs and chunks of heated food. Think burnt pieces of bread, patties, porridge lumps have been discovered in multiple places. At Kibara in Israel, there's charred remains from nearly 50 different plant species, mostly edible, nuts, fruits, seeds, tubers, etc. Okay, microware also gives data for this. The prize winner for most diverse grout in their teeth is the Shenandoah 3 skeletons out of the 40 that they have found at Shenandoah. He was the guy that was ultimately stabbed in the chest and died, but they found date palms, pea, lentil, vetch family, roots, tubers were all eaten by this guy, as well as meat. And they also find residue on lithics. So lots of data sources for this. And I mentioned that there's evidence for water plants that required getting into water to find them, basically. There's a new technique that has been developed in the last 5 years, and the name is no chronology, and it's basically dating when a group was in a cave by the soot on the top of the cave roof. Different layers of soot can now be analyzed to tell you and date when the cave was occupied. Okay, so it's essentially teeny stratigraphies written in soot, the smoke on the roof, basically. It's just like in effect, a barcode. So you can count the number of times the Neanderthal group stayed during a reasonably thick archaeological layer, that this helps to specify when they were around. So there's also evidence that they were probably cooking stews, because think of marrow broths for supper, basically. The use of grease, which they clearly were picking up from the animals that they were, the animal parts that they were bringing back in terms of marrow and fat, and spongy, grease-rich ends of large bones were classically smashed up to get to the marrow. Was a routine finding in Neanderthal kill sites, basically. And probably they were grinding seeds, soaking them, and evidence for some boiling, basically. I mentioned that there have been grindstones that have been found, indicating that in a variety of places, cereals were being turned into flour, that you could then do everything from potentially cooking them into biscuits, etc. Okay, so I never thought of Neanderthals with biscuits. Okay, so but there's evidence growing from evidence from grindstones. Okay. There is evidence that in some sites that Neanderthals were allowing fires to smolder. And one of the things that they think may have been happening was that they were producing jerky. Okay, they were smoking their meat in some of these sites. So because they could get a lot of meat, and sometimes they had excess amounts, and they could clearly use that for storing some of this. And there are a variety of sites that seem to indicate that this process was going on. And I mentioned earlier the question of whether they were actually using fermentation as a way to store food, basically, that given that fermentation takes a while, they would set up a process in water and then come back to eat. Much earlier, I mentioned that there's some evidence that hunter-gatherer guts apparently were much tougher than our current versions in terms of what they could process in terms of things that we wouldn't get within 10 feet of, but they obviously ate as well. So, okay. And again, the emphasis over and over that in terms of their butchery practices, that Neanderthals were after the richest parts of the animals that they killed, going after the marrow, fat, organs, but less so lean meat. They went after the fatty kinds of things in terms of avoiding rabbit starvation. In a recent study, they looked at 124 dental biofilm genomes from a variety of humans, Neanderthals, up to present day, modern humans, chimps, gorillas, howler monkeys. And so they were getting the genomes from all of these guys. And what they were looking at was the presence of a salivary amylase binding, starch digesting oral streptococci. Okay. And what they found was really interesting, and that is that Neanderthals and us have streptococci that are specific to starch digestion going back 600,000 years, which implies that it was probably Homo heidelbergensis and an early group, and perhaps all the way back to Homo erecti, that ultimately produced a streptococci that specialized in starch eating in the oral mouths, etc. So this says that we've been eating, think of tubers as an example, that they're pretty sure even Homo erectus was digging up in Africa, that starch-rich foods, possibly modified by cooking, have been a major source of our diet for hundreds of thousands of years, not just in the last couple of 100,000 years. So this is a really, I think, important study that these bacteria, streptococci, were specifically developed to pull the nutrients out of starch, and particularly cooked starch. Okay, so even more interesting. So our oral biome and starch digestion was a long time ago developed, basically. They found a variety of these genus level streptococci that were specific to everybody, even going back to howler monkeys, basically. Okay. So starch at 600,000 years, basically. So carbo loading, basically. Okay. Neanderthal homes and hearths. Okay. Fundamentally, as I pointed out, Neanderthals were nomadic. They weren't sitting around except very rarely in one spot, that they were classic hunter-gatherers that kept on moving, basically. The world was the land and moving in it was their life, basically. And hunting moving animals was the reason for this. So they were pretty much constantly in motion, staying at various places for short periods of time. The current thinking is that the group size was typically 10 to 12, never lived in large densities except occasionally, maybe at Neumark in Germany. They had those giant elephants, so they gathered in bigger groups for a while, but no evidence of villages, just occasional gatherings. And they used a variety of types of sites, basically. There was a home site, a killing site, and an animal processing site were the three basic sites that have been analyzed over and over again. And they would often revisit home sites, which were classically about 60 to 70 meters square. Albert Romani is the classic one in Spain. It was inhabited on and off for almost 70,000 years until about 40,000 years ago when they disappeared. And at other sites, there's only a single hearth evidence indicating a kind of short visit. But these living spaces were totally unlike mixed up hyena dens. Neanderthal spaces were intentionally designed centered on the hearths. They did not do stone encircled fireplaces. For some reason, Neanderthals never did that in comparison to African sapiens. And now with modern microlayer analysis and experimental analysis, looking at thin sections of earth, bone changes, color with a variety of heat levels, they can identify the exact historical temperatures of the hearth with different patterns of fire usage. So they also know that Neanderthals like to clean up their ash dumps and clear it out from where they were living. They apparently use manganese dioxide as a fire starter, a mineral that lowers the temperature that you can start a fire at. And modern archaeological analysis has advanced tremendously in the last 100 years. They do thin slice analysis, looking at the length of occupation. They do microscopic analysis of the fat that's present, of the ash that's present, of the thickness of the hearth, etc. So they can get a tremendous amount of data, basically. But hearths were the center of Neanderthal life in the places that they were living in. And the ability to micro-evaluate these layers, basically, they looked at the use of water. Black layer is the oldest, ash above it. Sediment sample, thin sections, looking at the periods of use of that fire, the different layers. Ash dumps were moved elsewhere. Rubbish middens that have been discovered. Bone will change color at different temperatures. A low fire for sleeping, bigger fires for cooking. Chemical analysis for animal fat, and where they created, placed, and maintained the fire can now be analyzed. They burned pine in the north, different tree species in the south. They've even been shown to have used brown coal and lignite, despite having trees around for fires. And this is one of the classic Kabara Israel. This is the same hearth going dated to 70,000 years and multiple usages at the same spot, basically. So this was a well-loved spot, basically. But despite all of this new data gathering technology, Neanderthals' fire skills continue to be debated. Nobody today denies that they used fires, which hominins have been doing for 1 million years. The question is, was it deliberate setting or fire based on lightning strikes, etc.? From around 120K, fire was obviously a part of everyday life, but the question still remains about whether they scavenged or produced it is still being debated in some quarters. The problem is that some sites exist with relatively rich archaeology, but no presence of fire. Whether they were sometimes using fire inside caves or putting the fire outside of the cave is one of the hypotheses going on. Maybe Neanderthals were perfectly able to make fire at will, but simply changed how and where they used it according to different ways of living. If during the very icy Quina phases, they tended to make hearths just outside of the cave, there would be no trace inside except for a bit of charcoal. Which is what they actually found. 40 Neanderthal sites have manganese dioxide data. And so they think that they would use this mineral to help light their fires. It's a fire accelerant, basically, when powdered. We know about the birch bark tar technology, that they were using tar to create multifunctional spearheads. And they almost certainly probably knew that flint could be used to spark fires, given the history among hunter-gatherers. Okay. Interesting, as I mentioned, they didn't put stones around their fire, although they would occasionally put hollows around the fire. But interesting, they did it differently than African sapiens in their hearth style. And occasionally, stone blocks and cobbles were placed by fires. Pine is the most commonly burned wood in Neanderthal fire sites. Interestingly, they tended to, there's evidence that they burned butchery waste, that they swept out ash from inside the caves, that they burned their grass bedding in various sites. And just like ethnographic sleeping fires that have been found historically, Neanderthals also used small hearths near the walls to heat them up while they were sleeping, whereas others were much hotter in the center of the cave, used for cooking. So different stagings, basically. Some produce more smokiness for probably curing hides. They think they were also using fires to drive animal herds in hunting, and also for potentially managing the environment, clearing out brush, basically, so that they had better. And Newmark Nord is one of the classic examples of this. And the big question was whether there was natural burning that created a landscape that then the Neanderthals moved into, or whether the Neanderthals were the fire starters and produced the landscape that they liked better when it had been fired, basically. Okay, that we said.
Charlie,
Yes.
I'm a little bit confused. I've been looking at my dictionary here. You say they didn't have stone fireplaces, but they had hearths. What were they made out of?
Hearths are wood fires. So basically the flame they see is the ash leftovers from a wood fire.
So basically what you're saying is they had an area of dirt and they piled the wood there and they lit it, and that was the hearth. They didn't surround it by anything like stone.
Right.
Okay.
That's correct. We now think that Neanderthals were among the first hominids to create complex, intentional divisions of space in the places where they were staying, basically, with the hearth being kind of the center of this place. And there are a number of places that reveal pretty complicated patterns of space usage. The ground was cleaned in between phases. They apparently used hide floor mats. The rock shelter at Abrik Romani had a really interesting setup, basically. They arranged their space in terms of what they were doing in various spots. So they were sort of doing a little architecture of their spaces. They took out their garbage in terms of dumping rubbish outside most frequently, but sometimes within the cave, but only in certain spots. And they were cleaning up after themselves, basically. And apparently there's...
Say, Charlie?
Yes.
I had a question about that fire. I mean, I have never had a fire, obviously, in a cave, but can't you get smoked out by that fire? Don't you think it would be more advantage?
Well, they've shown, there have been a couple of studies that have done experiments to figure out, and the experiments showed where the best place in the cave was to put the fire so that it wasn't, you wouldn't die of smokiness. And those are exactly the same spots that Neanderthal used.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so they knew their fire and what would happen in a cave depending on where you put it. Okay, so they knew their stuff clearly. And in several places, while we talk about caves the most, remember that Neanderthals lived out in the open the most, okay? And we have very few archaeological sites that were left outside of caves that we could tell what they were, what their living spaces were when they were outdoors. Two of them are at Tor Farage in Jordan, and one is in France at La Folière near in France, where they found post holes. Okay, and the campsite at La Folière showed that they had very, again, specific internal placement of things that they were doing. And this is the remake of the La Folière site, basically, that they put down posts that they lined with either wood or plants, that they had very specific sites for where they were sleeping, where they were putting the nighttime fires, where they were putting the other fires, but highly structured. The stone making was in one site, the woodwork was in a different site, etc. So again, a very specific placement of activities within their site, even outdoors, as they have found in caves. This was a well-designed shelter, basically, and refitting the process of archaeologists putting the original stone and all of its chopped off portions spread out all around, and spending hundreds of hours producing the original stone from which the stone tool was made out of, has shown where things lay, et cetera, et cetera. So they even found 4 sizable sandstone blocks that were hauled into the space that you could speculate were potential tables or chairs. Okay, so remember that they found some really interesting kitchen tools at Romani in Spain. And at Romani, there are at least 17 different hearth levels that they've examined, and it was the most revisited spot, one of the most revisited spots in the Neanderthal history, basically. Again, they had stone blocks that were brought in near the fires, and there was a shallow depression in the ground that could have been filled with water, into which hot stones were dropped to boil or generate steam. So they think that they were cooking, basically, in some interesting ways, and that their living spaces were also just as interesting as some of our later houses. At Tora Faraj in Jordan, there was a rockfall, a dumping site, a windbreaker. There was a butchery site, a lithic processing site with a hearth, a bedding area of space where they were doing bone and antler work, another bedding area with a smaller hearth nearby. Okay, so they were basically designing their interiors to fit in a way that felt most comfortable and worked the best, basically. Another camping, hunting camp in Spain was identified, and again, a main cluster of materials clearly related to the presence of hearths. So again, analyzing the space of these guys. And then there's the question of, because these guys were nomads, nomads have to carry things. And then the question is, what did they carry things in? Okay, so the most likely thinking is that they had skin and leather bags, basically, or potentially guts of animals that they were using to as bags to store things in. But they had to carry their stone cores and tools, birch tar, food, spears, digging sticks, babies, etc. So clearly, they were using some of their hide work to produce not only clothing, but skin and leather bags. So containers for transportation, basically. I mentioned that they think that there were basically 3 different types of nomadic sites. One was the home site, was the killing site, and one was the butchery site. That they did different things at different places, and part of the way they identify this is that some of the sites lack the later stage lithic products and the richest parts of the animals that were taken to the home site, basically. But they would do some tool carving, leave the remnants, but take the tool, and they would chop up the animals so that they took the organs, brain, fat, etc., but often left the lean meat. Okay. Okay. Some sites were used over and over, but in many ways there were no permanent destinations because these guys kept moving. Although there were some sites like Romani where they kept coming back to for tens of thousands of years, basically. Some were really nice spots, basically. Whether they were vacation homes or what, we'll never know. But always on the move, never-ending odyssey, basically, for these guys. Staying for short periods, typically in all of these sites. But there was some repetitive visiting at certain places. And the types of stone tools they had and the source places for the stone that they made into the tools give us information about where the Neanderthals were traveling. The more distant the rock type, the fewer artifacts made from it there will be. And typically less than 10% will come from a far-flung source that was over 40 miles away. The very longest distances for rock sources was about 190 miles, where obsidian and flint were their most precious kind of rock sources. And those could be much further than their typical rock sources. But whenever they were moving, you have to remember that they always needed to keep in mind where were the rock sources for making the tools that they needed to hunt with. So these guys always had geology in mind, basically, and these guys knew both their geology in terms of where things were, and particularly where precious rock sources were, because they needed to make their tools in order to hunt. So Neanderthals were geologists, basically. They knew where to find different kinds of rock in order to do their stone making. And the original estimates of how big Neanderthal range size were based on some of this idea about they were using the artifacts as proxies for range sizes, and they came up initially with the idea that it was about 40 miles, but in more recent thinking, Neanderthal ranges were much bigger than that, so that the earlier theories were in fact wrong. So today's best ultra marathoners can cover 600 miles in a week. and normal athletes can do 120 miles in about 24 hours. We think that because Neanderthal legs were built differently than ours, shorter, more muscular, etc., that they were probably not good long distance runners, but they were terrific striders, basically, in terms of shorter distances. And shorter legs making them up to 10% slower, probably, they think. And the impact of the kind of terrain, they think, so a day's trek drops sort of below 60 miles in a day. But the artifacts were sourced from sometimes much further away. So obsidian has been found to be up to 190 miles away in Europe. So terrific, impressive knowledge of resources across an enormous range, basically. One isotope study in Portugal recently compared isotopes in their teeth to determine both the diet and where they were moving. And about 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals were eating goats during the summer, larger fauna like horse and deer in the winter, and they searched over a area that was about 600 kilometers square. Interestingly, the later modern humans covered half that square mileage compared to the Neanderthals, possibly because of the increase in population density, but Neanderthals were moving around basically much more than we used to think. And again,
Charlie,
with
these distances, was there any evidence that some of them were traders? That basically they're the ones that carried the rocks to other people and they traded?
Well, there's some thinking that some of the obsidian sites were both available to some Neanderthals, but some Neanderthals were trading for the really good stuff. So they think there were, because they know, one of the things to go back to is the patrilocal style of getting your woman. That is, women came from other Neanderthal groups. And so they think that we used to think of Neanderthals as basically sitting forever in one valley, and that's been totally disproved, that they were moving around much larger landscapes than that, crossing multiple river valleys, etc. And so they think there was obviously contact going on between a variety of Neanderthal groups. And basically, if you had contact, you not only exchanged women occasionally, but you exchanged whatever valuable material the other group had that they were willing to trade with you. So they think trading was going on among Neanderthals as well as modern humans.
Charlie,
so,
since they lived in Northern Europe where you have winter, was there any indication that they would have understood use of snow or ice for refrigeration? I mean, I don't even know where you'd find evidence of that, but.
It's a good question, but I've never read anything specifically about that. If they're taught that they've hypothesized, as I pointed out, about fermentation, which was a way of preserving meat in water, then it would be logical to think that they must have come across frozen animals and got the idea that you could freeze things. But remember, paleontologists are now moving away from the idea that Neanderthals were cold specialists. That there were Neanderthals that lived in higher, more northern Europe, but the vast majority, they think, of Neanderthals were forest-dwelling, warmer species. Okay, that's the modern look of Neanderthal. There were some, and there was obvious movement because of glaciation, that those in the north would be pushed south or starved to death, at times, and then they would recolonize when the glaciers moved back up. So there was a dynamic to where and how close to the cold they were getting, basically. But again, that the majority historically Neanderthals probably lived in warmer climates than we historically thought of them living in. Primarily, the bias came because almost all of the first Neanderthals were found in the much northern latitudes, as opposed to the later Neanderthals that were discovered all over the place in warmer climates, basically. And so they now think the majority of Neanderthals were probably warmer forest dwelling kinds of species rather than tundra ice dwelling creatures. Okay, that's an important shift in the thinking about Neanderthals.
Wouldn't that suggest that maybe their muscular massiveness might have undergone some shift toward a more gracile form?
Absolutely. And where you find that is if you look at the Israeli Neanderthals, they look like modern humans in terms of their skeletal weight, etc. So they're.
But that would also reduce their caloric requirement, wouldn't it?
Probably. Right. So there's more variation in Neanderthals than we classically think. We need to be careful about using the early model of kind of there were just sort of short, stumpy Neanderthals. Okay, but there were actually some 6-foot characters walking around as well.
Well, and among modern humans, there are the Alaskan natives that
right.
are quite short, stocky, muscular.
Right, and that's the latitude correlation in terms of that skeletal height, etc.
Yeah.
Charlie, I want to make sure you said most lived in warmer climates. So
that if you read Kindred, I believe that's her current conclusion.
Well, what do you think? I mean, that's
I think that's probably true. That if you look at the kinds of food they were eating, which areas they were populating, that much of it is now in forested as opposed to tundra areas. So I think there was that they lived in both places depending on the timing of the glaciation, etc. But there were as many Neanderthals in Southern Europe as there were in Northern Europe, is my thinking now.
Wow.
I just read a kind of related, I'm going to present it, I think, next month, but a new article on the consequences of wiping out the bison to indigenous Americans. That the systematic elimination of buffalo by the army, hunters, etc., where they were basically hunting to kill them just occasionally to get the hide and the tongue and leaving all the meat to rot, basically killed the bison culture of the American natives. And as a consequence, they showed that within 50 years, the Sioux Lakota Indians were the tallest humans on the planet while they were hunting the buffalo. They were 6 feet plus. And within 50 years, they dropped by an inch or two. As an example of how quickly physiologies can change based on the animals you're hunting or their disappearance. So I think sort of a similar context in terms of what we've been talking about the Neanderthals here. So, okay. Occasionally, there was some genetic isolation in various spots. And but they were probably mixing it up in terms of their travels and getting their women, etc. But the idea that they're not stuck in one valley, basically, should be the modern conception, basically, and that they were traveling around a lot. And as to the earlier questions about sourcing, Neanderthals themselves were carrying artifacts, or objects were being exchanged between groups from different regions, basically, the possibilities there. And some more recent hunter-gatherers, the territories go from about 100 miles to 7,000 square miles in terms of modern hunter-gatherers. So the ranges for Neanderthals in higher latitudes were probably more likely towards the upper end of that figure in terms of survival necessities. And there have been attempts to figure out what the territories were, and again, it's basically continued to. One of the issues is pretty convincing evidence that the bigger your group, the more culture you have, the more possibility that you're going to exchange technological knowledge that you've developed. I think there's evidence from that we reviewed about the kinds of spears they were using, that they would fluctuate from, while living in mostly smaller groups, they had contact with other groups in their travels, so that in effect there was more extended networks in Neanderthals, just like there were in modern humans. And Rag Sykes comments that following recent evidence, the European late middle Paleolithic, and therefore the Neanderthals, must be considered as cognitively equivalent to early anatomically modern middle Stone Age types, basically, and that they had extended networks, basically transferring raw materials at times as well. And that the kind, somebody in the background. So think of stone technology as kind of a cultural sign of your particular group. If a Neanderthal is doing one type, as an example, I showed you pictures of the McQuoquin stone type in the eastern part of Europe that looked like bifaces, except they were asymmetrical. If one Neanderthal group ran across that, they'd know that this was not us, basically. So they knew there were different cultures even within the Neanderthal groups. And remember, we're still talking about incredibly few fossils, that there are fewer than 40 complete Neanderthal skeletons, and only 3 of them have high coverage genomes so far. But there are thousands of skeletal parts in museums representing hundreds of different individuals, but not complete skeletons. And the end of the Neanderthals, you can sort of think as kind of both cultural assimilation and genetic assimilation, which we'll review in our last one next month. But you need social networks in order to survive and to reproduce, and individuals with larger social networks probably cope better in the long run than highly isolated groups. So it provided opportunities for mating, shared childbearing, transfer of cultural knowledge, etc. As we've been talking, obsidian transfer is kind of the classic marker for how far the ranges of these guys were, which probably were 2 to 3 to 400 kilometer ranges, basically, in terms of obsidian. And the question of why did they need so many animal hides? One, because if you remember, you needed 6 deer to keep up the family's caloric intake, basically. One thing you can do with boiling hides is you can make glue, which you can use for a variety of things, but clothing is obviously the most obvious answer to why Neanderthals were hunting animals besides food reason, that they used it for clothing. And almost all the original Neanderthal paintings showed them in sort of capes of leather, not clothes. And the thinking now is for survival purposes, you basically needed clothing, and that Neanderthals were producing clothing, that they didn't need eyed needles in order to do it. You can use a bone.
Hey, Charlie.
Yeah.
The question I have, you were talking about food, that they needed a lot of food, but didn't they waste a lot of food by not taking lean meat and they just took choice cuts and selections of the animal?
The likelihood is they probably did both.
Oh,
they had enough. They were skilled enough hunters to kill enough food creatures in order to supply them both with the stuff they liked and leaving behind the stuff they didn't want. So we don't know. There's no evidence, just flashed association of Neanderthals having pets. Okay, that they were also, that wolves ended up being dogs for modern humans, but did that in fact occur for Neanderthals on occasion. Okay,
so do you think they killed more animals than they really need if they skipped the lean meats and stuff?
Yeah, I think that's probably the case. That there was because the evidence seems to be that they were pretty selective in many ways. So they took what they wanted and left what they didn't routinely use, and they knew the issue about starvation from lean meat. So
but when they were starving, they probably weren't so selective about the meat.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. So here's a reconstruction with a nice fur covering, but the likelihood is that they were doing something more like this on a routine basis, that they knew how to protect themselves when they needed to protect themselves, depending on what the particular climate was in the region that they were in, basically. There's actually very little evidence for clothes. There is evidence for thread from stone lithic evidence, but whether they were doing things like this is speculation, basically. And shoes, no evidence for hard-soled shoes, but softer foot coverings could clearly have been used. There's speculation that a deer's hind leg provides a ready-made tube to slide a foot into, and it shrink wraps as it dries. So they could have been using that for foot covering as well. And it's particularly likely that like the Quina group of Neanderthals, which was the severe winter only reindeer eating group, were making clothes to survive, basically. And they've even estimated that an adult would need at least 5 large hides to make clothing, and it would take 20 to 80 hours to do hide processing to make that, plus for the kids, etc. So lots of animals in order to get lots of hides. And the data is primarily from the severely worn teeth that we have in Neanderthals for the amount of hide working that they were using. There's some evidence for bone awls that could have been used for puncturing. You don't need a needle to put together a piece of leather. And again, that containers were probably mostly leather-based, but that we haven't actually found. This is hypothesis. Even some hypothesizing about tanning of leather. There's some evidence for, because tanning will produce better waterproofing, etc. And okay.
Charlie,
Yes.
have we found much evidence of stone bowls to boil things in? I mean, it seems to me that we should have found some if they were around.
Yeah, what they have found is depressions in caves that they think they were potentially using those for boiling. But again, the hypothesizing is that you can use everything from a skull to wood bark. And there's a method for, depending on the water level, that you can use. I'm blocking on what the item is for boiling purposes. So there, you can get ingenious in terms of figuring some of this out. Okay, Neanderthals clearly had a big time relationship with birds. Okay, and the thinking is that just like Native Americans, that bird feathers were probably being used for identification, clan markings, decoration, that they were used symbolically to identify who was who. Also the idea, of course, that they were using ochre as body painting pigments, basically, has also been around for a while. And it's very clear that Neanderthals had a special relationship to eagles. They were basically the fingers of eagles. They have a lot of cut marks, basically as if they were detaching the talons of eagles, as well as cutting the feathers in such a way that they could remove the entire wing structure to be used as ceremonial, symbolic, whatnot. You'll see a picture in a second. But clearly they think that claws were being used for symbolically oriented ways and by Neanderthals. In one site in Italy, there are 600 bones belonging to 22 species of birds. And feathers of various colors were being removed, but they apparently had a special relationship to black feathers. Okay, and the person to read is Clive Finlayson, who is the Gibraltar Neanderthal specialist who's done all of the cave excavations there for the last 30 years. But he himself is a master birder and basically has been researching Neanderthals and birds all over Europe, basically. He's got two good books to read. The Smart Neanderthal Humans Who Became Extinct are pretty good reads. But Neanderthals basically were capturing almost every type of bird. They were eating eggs, they were eating birds, but they were also hunting for feathers. At Gibraltar, butchered birds were found at 5 different levels, 100 bones from 12 different species. At one site, they were mostly medium and small size, partridge, rock dove, jays, magpies, crows. Many of the birds related to butchery sites, because birds, crows, etc., vultures, all want to take a hit if they can find dead meat, basically. And historically, there was a bias thinking that catching birds was an advanced hunting technique that only modern humans could do. Well, throw that out the window, basically, okay, because it's not true. Neanderthals were perfectly capable. Native Americans had a technique for finding eagle nests and then covering themselves nearby until the eagle landed, and then grabbing them by the talons to capture them. Because among Native Americans, eagle hunting was a big time cultural bonus if you were a warrior. Well, turns out Neanderthals were probably doing much the same things in a variety of ways. We talked, I think, last time about throwing sticks that were being used in wetlands in Germany, basically, that they think they were doing duck hunting using that technology. They collected tendons, perhaps for a cord, maybe for nets, but possibly using some types of projectiles to capture darts, that kind of thing for bird hunting. But this is Clive Finlayson exhibiting what he thinks was a Neanderthal cultural thing that they were doing, using the entire feather to sort of cover themselves with, maybe ceremonially, etc. He did one massive study where he looked at almost 1,700 Eurasian, North African, Europe fossil sites, looking for the connection between birds and Neanderthal. And what he showed was throughout this entire region, Neanderthals were highly associated with corvids and raptors, particularly black vultures and their relatives. So birds of a feather, basically. They were intentionally extracting feathers or terminal pedal fingers of large raptors and other birds, and they exploited them for their feathers or claws, or for personal ornaments of some symbolic behavior, basically. So there's clear and widespread association between Neanderthals, raptors, and corvids. The cut marks are generally on the bone supporting the flight feathers and not on the meat-bearing elements. Okay, so they may have been eating, but they were specifically going after the flight feathers. And his thinking is that they were using raptors for non-utilitarian purposes. We'll look at in a second the Crepina eagle talons that are historic. But they were particularly interested in dark feathers. We don't know why, but that appears to be what they were often after, according to Finlayson. And he thinks it was for personal adornment and symbol. These are Neanderthals' favorite raptors. By far the biggest was the golden eagle, then this vulture, and then the bearded vulture as well. These were the ones that Neanderthals loved the most. They caught golden eagles, basically, he thinks, for decorative, symbolic purposes. Finlayson's son, Stuart, is also a big-time birder, and he's done a number of studies of this particular eagle and Neanderthals. He thinks that they were probably being ambushed by Neanderthals at carcass sites, basically. They date to up to 130K, for at least 85,000 years before Neanderthals, before modern humans showed up in Europe. So clearly Neanderthals were the first eagle catchers. We've mentioned that. Okay, raptors. So they were butchering raptor feet or claws, especially eagles, from between 100K to 45K in France and Italy and Spain as well. And the at one site in France, 20 bones from large raptors from multiple layers are almost all talons. And so they were particularly interested, apparently, in these. And then this is the famous Crapina, the raptor talons that they found there from a white-tailed eagle. And this is the way it was sort of first presented from 130K as a kind of pendant or necklace. It could have been a rattle. In fact, these were found in diverse areas of the Croatian site. So it's really unclear whether they were ever put together, but there is evidence that they were strung, because there's some fiber findings in a number of them, as well as pigment associations as well. But they found smooth over cut marks and small bright areas that resemble contact polish on a number of these talents. So they were clearly used. Whether they were clearly used all together, Rag Sykes isn't perfectly sure that they were used as a necklace. So the question of pigment use and how they were attached to something, whether they were strung up together, etc.
Could they have been used as tools, as cutting tools?
I haven't seen any speculation in that direction. It could, they're sharp enough, so possibly, but I haven't seen any hypotheses around that. Okay. So I think there's pretty good evidence that they liked feathers. They were using feathers probably symbolically in some way. They loved birds of prey in the crow family, because often those are the same birds that are going to be at kill sites, so they could have been available by throwing sticks or as well. So that's birds. Few more minutes. Neanderthal burials have been a contested area of Neanderthal studies for a long time. It's how we first found them. But the question of where we found them and whether they were burials is the question mark. We know that modern humans have had a very interesting mortuary history, okay? We have buried, mummified, embalmed, throw them into pits, cannibalize them, eat the brains, and get kuru. Native American and Tibetan sky burials, cremation, graveyards, turning of the bones, reburials, reshining of skulls, Viking death ships, coffins hung from cliffs, etc. So we've been very inventive in how we treated our dead, okay? And the likelihood is that Neanderthals were just as creative, okay? Is my basic message. It's extremely difficult to prove that they were intentionally leaving bodies in a particular place. And numerous reasons could lead to individual Neanderthals taking their last breaths in a cave, succumbing to sickness, injuries, starvation, violence. The problem comes with using an inflexible tick list of how the remains of the dead should have been treated, which may overlook otherwise meaningful actions taken by living Neanderthals. Burials aren't a gold standard. They're simply the most obvious way to treat a dead body. Then there's a spectrum going from a specifically dug pit to a narrow hollow or niche to simply covering with sediments. Were they basically getting rid of a dead body so that they could avoid the smell and the decay, or were they doing something symbolic because these people meant something to them? But they were exposed, cut up, burned, curated, displayed, recycled, even eaten occasionally. Okay. Kabara 2 in Israel, the largest complete Neanderthal upper body from Israel. I've shown you the beautiful skeleton that got produced from that. You can see how small finger and wrist bones fell into the empty stomach cavity as it decomposed in the site where it was buried, they think. Any site with even a partially complete Neanderthal skeleton is a signal for something singular going on, because typically you don't find complete skeletons, incredibly rare. And these days, there's a whole forensic taxonomy procedure for trying to figure out what happened to bones in a particular place that they found it. There are some criteria that have been proposed for burials. Pits should be artificial and filled by one sediment deposit, very different to the surrounding level. Skeletons should lie complete at the very base of the pit, preferably in an extended or flexed position, and any associated objects should be unusual. Fulfilling these exacting characteristics certainly gives confidence for a deliberate burial, yet they're so stringent that even some historical human cases would be rejected on just these two criteria. And these conditions are met at relatively few Neanderthal fossil sites. And one study recognized only 35 Eurasian Neanderthal burials, which underscores the fact that burials were not always a part of Neanderthal behavior. The most convincing evidence for deliberately excavated burial pits come from the French sites at La Chapelle, La Percier, Roc du Marsal, and at Saint-Césaire, and from the Ukrainian site, Kikuba, and from Kabara and Amud in Israel. Those are sort of the most deliberate, acknowledged sites. There's one in Syria, and then of course there's the big time 13 or so in Chandera Cave. And that is being currently re-excavated to modern criteria. They found an entirely new, the Shenandoah Z skeleton, and that they believe were intentionally buried, basically. And that some of the prior ones that they discovered were almost certainly buried as well. But even in the best cases, it's not clear whether this represents meaningful connection to the dead or simply housekeeping of stinking things, basically. So covering up a stinking corpse, basically, is one end of the hypothesizing. Neanderthal burials are simple affairs, rarely contain any evidence of grave goods, okay, unlike the more significant what you find in later sapiens graves in Western Asia. But it's clear that there were some intentional burials, basically, and that Neanderthals had an interest in mortality. They took bodies apart, they ate some occasionally, and that a whole number of these were not accidental burials. The Amud child in Israel has a single grave good, a deer jaw, but there are no instances of skeletons with significant grave goods. Okay, so at that point, we will continue next time in our last session for sure in this series. looking at the final burial material and then on how did they disappear. Okay, so the extinction of the Neanderthals. Okay, so thank you for listening again. It's such a good group. We'll see you next time. Have a good
Okay,
summer.
thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye-bye.
you.